So this week in preparation, I read Lemmy's autobiography entitled White Line Fever. So
Oh,
I'll be
Jesus.
referencing
Oh,
that
my
quite a bit. I also watched some of those documentaries you mentioned, the behind the music, or I think it's called classic albums about the album and some stuff about Lemmy. There's a lot of material online. I should mention that it was made kind of apparent to me that even this autobiography, which I will be quoting from liberally as fact, might not be factual all the time, but okay. But we'll take it with a grain of salt. That's okay.
Good disclaimer. All right.
Good disclaimer. So let's start with this auspicious man's birth. He was born Ian Fraser Kilmister, which is an awesome name, just
I was
right
gonna,
off the bat.
that's a real last name.
That's
That's
a real
not a
last name.
stage name. Kilmister. Oh man.
Yes. He's born on Christmas Eve in 1945 in a
Get out.
place
Good better.
called Stoke-on-Trent. It's the Midlands of the UK, about an hour south of Manchester. So significantly distant from London, different culture, etc. And his father, get this, is a deacon in the Royal Air Force, and his mother is a librarian. Now,
Oh God.
let that
The
sink in for a
recipe.
second. That is
A
mild
deacon.
mannered with a capital M.
Yeah.
But okay, his dad left early in his life. Lemmy didn't see him again until he was like 25. So perhaps that's where he gets the
Yeah, there we
rambling
go. There we go.
gene,
That's it.
right?
The rambling gene from the priest or from the what was it?
It's the
From
deacon.
the deacon? Oh, okay.
Yes. Yeah, deacon had to ramble.
All right.
Now, when he's about 10, his mother gets remarried. They move over to northern Wales, and it's kind of like the northern tip of Wales that's sticking out. So not super far from where they were before, but it's Wales. It's a different country. It's a different culture. He's the only English kid at school in a Welsh school, so he gets picked on a lot. I assume that's where he develops some of his boy named Sue toughness. And this town in Wales is kind of like a seaside resort that gets a lot of tourists, right? In the summer in particular. And so, despite living in kind of a small town, he gets a fair amount of early exposure to this young phenomenon called rock and roll. Keep in mind, he's born in 45. By the time
45,
he's
right.
a teenager, rock and roll is just starting to kick off. And the very first musician he falls in love with pretty much bases his career on. Any guesses?
Oh man.
Buddy
Elvis.
Holly.
Buddy Holly. Okay, I was gonna say Elvis, but I guess that would have been
Buddy
right.
Holly, the uber nerd, is what gets him to start playing guitar as a
Really?
teen.
Okay.
Yes. This is from Lemmy himself. He says, when I saw Buddy Holly play in 1958, I was, of course, there looking for girls. At that age, all you want to do is get laid. And I thought, that's the fucking job for me. I took a guitar to school. I was immediately surrounded by women. I couldn't play it. And with all due respect, you do have to learn a couple chords eventually, but not too many, though. That can ruin you.
So wait, he's out looking for tail at 13, by the way. You said he was born in 45 and he sees Buddy Holly in 58.
I think in
And he's there-
post-war Wales,
You're
you
right.
grow up fast.
It's a different
You
time.
do,
Yeah,
yeah,
he
that's a
started
good
smoking
point.
at 10,
Right.
drinking at
You need to
11.
Start repopulating Europe ASAP. All right, that's a good point.
So he knows from an early age that some of the bands he's in, in high school around 16, 17, that the Welsh bands aren't really going anywhere. People aren't committed where he's based. He's really trying for something. He has this vision in his head of some kind of stardom or the ability to get girls, basically. So the whole time he's been sneaking over to nearby Manchester and Liverpool, which are close together relatively, to see shows for a few years, sneaking in, right? And around the age of 18, he ends up deciding to move to Manchester. Now, as a side note, read this book. Lemmy is kind of the Forrest Gump of rock history. He seems to be around in the background shots of a lot of important moments. And
I remember one that, well, you'll hit on it, but it came from a prior episode. Yeah.
yeah, so for instance, he is a huge Beatles fan, and he saw them multiple times at the Cavern Club in Liverpool in the
Wow.
early 60s. And when he speaks of the Beatles, I just thought this was interesting. Like you have this vision of what this guy's going to be like, and he is that. He's that in some ways, but other times he would subvert my expectations. So when he speaks of the Beatles, he's gushing. It's startling. But he's just like, I lived it. You don't understand what it was like. There will never be another band like the Beatles. And I think one of the reasons for that is that he loves them because they were effectively local boys to him. But one of the interesting things I drew from it that I don't feel like I have read very much about is that he talks about how there's still this image of the Beatles as clean cut nice boys. And he clarifies that Brian Epstein, their manager, is the one that cleaned them up for public image purposes, but that Liverpool was in fact a rough seafaring town, in his words. And that Ringo in particular, he mentions, was from a neighborhood called the Dingle in Liverpool, which he equates to growing up in the Bronx in the 70s. And so by contrast, he's like, the Rolling Stones were Nancy boys. You know, they were mama's boys compared to the Beatles. They had the bad boy image. The Beatles were the rough and tumble guys because Liverpool was the rough and tumble place. And he tells a story about a show he was at. He says they were playing at the Cavern and someone in the audience called John gay. And he said he stopped the set, put down his guitar, went out in the crowd, found the guy, gave him the Liverpool kiss, and bloodied up his nose, and then jumped back on stage to finish the show.
Wow. Yeah. I had read a little bit about that. He said that the Rolling Stones were like, upper class, well-to-do parents, and that they were terrible live.
Oh, interesting. Well,
yeah.
Well, certainly they were art school kids, so they came from more money than probably that seems like the Beatles did. But I just thought that was an interesting aside that, yeah, he loves the Beatles. He was very much inspired by them and that phenomenon, especially coming out of what he thinks of as maybe his hometown.
Sure.
Or close to it. So, okay, back to Lemmy and his attempts to get musical things started in Manchester now, right? This is an era when no one owned any equipment at all. So being the bass player was as simple as owning a bass guitar, which I should point out at this point, Lemmy did not do. He's the guitar player. But by 1965, he's 20. He's playing in bands around Manchester. Nothing's really sticking. Turnover is high. One night he goes to see a band called the Rocking Vicars at a club, who are, their stage act is that they are dressed like Finnish native people, the Sami people from the Laplands. That's their shtick, is like wearing reindeer boots and Laplander gear.
Okay.
Even though they're British. Right. And he thinks they rock, and he just immediately asks around about how he can join the band. And he auditions and he gets the gig. So he tells this story to illustrate both the times and the type of people that were in a band, like the Rockin' Vicars. His bandmate, called Ken, tells apparently this story happened to him around this time. He had a Mini Cooper that he loved. And at the time, wire wheels, which were hubcaps with all the spokes sticking out, like a cool version of a hubcap, they were really expensive. They were really tough to come by. So one day, this bandmate of his, Ken's, driving along, and a second Mini Cooper blows past him on the road, one that has the cool hubcaps. And then a little farther up the road at the next roundabout, he sees the car flipped upside down, wrecked, the dude hanging out, bloody and unconscious. So what does this dude do? He takes the hubcaps. He gets the hell out of there. He hides him in a haystack because apparently it's a Bugs Bunny cartoon.
Oh, wow.
And then he phones the cops and goes back to wait for them to get this guy some medical attention.
Hey, at least he called the cops eventually.
That was nice of him. Yeah.
Times is tough. Now that was the other guy in the band in the
That
Vicars?
was the other guy in the Rocking Vicars. Yes.
Okay. Wow.
So,
all right.
So Lemmy's in this band
company.
for a bit. Yeah, they're touring around. They're having some amount of success. They record some singles. They actually have a minor hit with a cover of a Kinks song called Dandy, which, just because it's the first example I could find of Lemmy on a recording, he's playing guitar on this recording, not singing, I should point out. But it sounds so different than Motorhead. Let's just give that a quick listen. Now, of course, this is a full 15 years before Ace of Spades, the album that we're going to get into today. This is 1965. This album we're talking about today came out in 1980. But one through line here is I kept being impressed by the length and breadth of Lemmy's musical career. He really has weaved his way through a lot of times and things in a really interesting way. And so that's one of the ways he's classic.
Yeah, when you sent across this song, I didn't bother looking it up to see who was involved, but I assumed maybe he kicked the crap out of like single-handedly of all the guys in this band and not actually be in the band.
Right.
So that's pretty wild.
Beat them all up.
So this single leads to them touring the UK a bunch, and in some places he says having women come like tear their clothes off while they're playing, and women would run into the club with scissors trying to get a lock of their hair.
Jeez.
But listen, this could be nonsense, but he said, he claims again and again, there was occasionally and briefly an element of Beatlemania just to being in a rock band, any rock band at that time.
Got it. People were looking for another excuse to freak out, and the guys in the bands were like, yeah, sure, I'll take it.
It's like 65. We're still very early days of rock,
Yeah.
right? That era. The Vickers had this #1 hit in Finland and even toured there. And the Lemmy was quick to clarify that having a #1 in Finland is nearly meaningless in terms of sales. Like he's making jokes before even we can make the jokes. And because this came up, I just want to clarify again. I triple checked. The band is definitely from the UK. They are not Finnish, but they just dressed like Finnish people. And this gimmick seemed to work in Finland.
Great.
That was enough. That's enough in 1965. All right.
So this is really his first experience with some level of touring, with some light version of rock stardom, right? They have charting singles. They're touring extensively within the UK. They're occasionally venturing over to continental Europe, but it is just not enough for Lemmy. Okay, he leaves the rocking Vickers. He wants to be London big. Totally different
yeah.
thing, right?
Yep.
So he moves down there. He's like living 12 guys to a flat. There's no money. But the one dude he happens to know in London when he gets there, because he's not from there, keep in mind, the one dude he happens to know through whatever connection happens to be sharing an apartment with Noel Redding at the time.
Jeez.
And when Noel's fledgling band needs an extra set of hands, Lemmy gets recruited as a roadie for the Jimi Hendrix Experience.
Oh,
yes. Yeah.
And he like tours with them for a couple years as a roadie.
Oh, really? It's that long? That's so
Yeah.
funny. In the Jimi Hendrix book, it didn't mention how long Lemmy was with them. So I remember in the episode I just mentioned it. But that's funny. A couple years. Wow.
It must have been from the very early days of the Experience even getting off the ground, because they made it seem like most of it was during the time when they were known in England, but not at all known in the States.
Right. Right.
And, you know, I should mention maybe he was only a passing figure. He said he didn't interact with Jimmy too much directly. He was just hired help, right? And Jimmy was this fast rising star. But there was one job he helped out with. Yes.
Oh yeah. I'll say that kind of explains a lot too, because I've met a couple roadies. My buddy Trevor has been a roadie for Black Sabbath and AC/DC and Ozzy Osbourne, and so all these guys were at his wedding, and it's a rough and tough group of people.
Oh,
so
yeah.
That kind of helps me understand kind of the direction he takes in this part of his story.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that kind of working class, because it is almost like a tradesman kind of job without any of the glamour of rock and roll, if you will, but kind of on the sidelines of rock and roll, moving shit around, and certainly all the drugs and some of the cast off women, I'm sure. Well, so let me clarify. So as I said, he didn't interact much with Jimmy, but there was one job Jimmy needed him to do consistently, which was score him acid. And he said he'd get Jimmy 10 hits, and Jimmy would break him off 3 of those hits, which Lemmy recounts as very fair. Now, and speaking of being a roadie and the lifestyle there, and he does say, I'm pretty sure that at this point Lemmy had been experimenting with drugs and alcohol for a little bit. We mentioned he started smoking at age 11, but this is when he starts to really make it his lifestyle. And he's quoted as saying something like, "You cannot go on a 3-month tour without being on something. I don't care what they say. Keep fit, eat your greens, drink juice, fuck off." Okay. And by something, he's referring to acid, weed, dexedrine, mandrax, blues, in quotes, black beauties, Tuinol, methadrine, amphetamine sulfate, aka speed, and one unfortunate time, atropine, aka belladonna. So he and some friends took a lot of it accidentally, thinking it was speed. He ended up having to be administered an antidote at a hospital. And
Ephedrine? What was it?
It's called atropine. It's also known as belladonna. Apparently, in the Victorian era, I think women used to use a very small amount of it to make their pupils dilate. That's why it's called belladonna.
Ah, okay.
But it's a strong poison / hallucinogen. We're not going to go into the pharmacology of it. You can look up the Wikipedia article.
You need an antidote. You don't just ride it out.
You need an anecdote. Yes.
Jesus Christ.
Yes. And he even mentioned that the antidote to belladonna took 2 weeks to fully work. He said it was a weird time while he was waiting for the antidote to work. He'd be at home reading a book and look down and realize that there was no book and that he wasn't even at home.
God, that's ridiculous.
All right. That's the clip. That's the front end of the show there.
So the drug thing is going to continue. I hope you realize. So one time he tells a story about how they bought a canister of Mandrax, which recall is sort of the British equivalent to Quaaludes.
Right.
But by the time they opened it up, it had melted in the heat. So they're not going to let it go to waste, obviously. So they laid it out and used a rolling pin and like a hair dryer and wound up with a paper sheet of Mandrax that you'd break a square off of and eat it. And he said sometimes you'd get nothing, just the outer coating of the pill or whatever. Sometimes you'd get 3 hits. They called it opiate Russian roulette.
Oh my
Wow.
God. Damn. When you talked about lifestyle, I was going to make fun of the choice of the word lifestyle. It's like, no, this is his lifestyle.
This is his lifestyle.
Yeah, and you didn't
existence
even say alcohol. You skipped. You didn't even bother. You didn't even have to say it. You just like skipped over that.
Of course. And speaking of clever turns of phrase from this beastly legend, Lemmy has some real gems to quote. And I've compiled a few of them into a little segment I'd like to call Did Lemmy Say It?
All right.
So first quote up, and I want you to answer the question, did Lemmy say this? First quote, horses make women horny.
Oh, of course.
Yes, because I know that he worked at a horse farm or something at one point in his life. So I'm going to say yes.
That's correct. He did say it. He worked at a horse stable as a lad, and this was the main learning he took from that period. Next up, the quote is, I've never had a problem with drugs. I've had problems with the police.
I'm gonna say that's like a Tupac quote.
I'm going to say yes, just because it's good. I don't know. We'll see.
Lemmy did not say that. That is not a Lemmy quote. That was the other stalwart of rock and roll insanity, Keith Richards. Okay, next up. When it came to chicks, we weren't really worried about quality in my band.
Oh, that's a yes.
That's gotta be trigger.
I feel like he invented the word chicks because it's in some of the song lyrics.
I mean, look, have you seen Lemmy up close? He's a rock and roll singer, but he's kind of grotesque also.
He's got warts. He's got warts.
He does. He does. Okay, I got a couple more here. Next one up. I don't especially recommend my lifestyle. It will slaughter the average person.
It's got to be real.
I'm going to say no. Just to say no.
Yes, Lemmy did say it. And in fact, in 1980, Lemmy tried getting new blood, which was a procedure for rock stars. Apparently, the doctors told him, if we give you this fresh blood, it will kill you. Your insides are too toxic for regular human blood. Now, that certainly could be an exaggeration, but that's the story.
That's great.
Okay. I just have a couple more here to round this segment out. Next quote, some may live, but the crazy never die.
That's from a movie. I don't think that's Lemmy.
Yeah, it's like Jim Morrison or something.
Nope, that is yet another drug-addled poet of the modern age, Hunter S. Thompson, not Lemmy.
All right.
And finally, last one, speaking about an approximately 10-year-old girl in passing, I'm going to be dating her in 10 years. Can you believe it?
So a man of sound morals. I believe it.
Oh, man. I don't know.
No, that was not Lemmy. That was convicted felon and current Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump in some B-roll from 1992. Thus concludes our segment, Did Lemmy Say It?
That's funny.
Wow. Very nice. Just the idea of the blood transfusion thing is insane. Like, can you like his blood was toxic, so mixing it was going to do something?
This guy walks the walk. I do have to say,
God.
I think all evidence points to the fact that this guy talks the talk and he lives it too. He lives the rock and roll lifestyle.
He was ahead of the game. Now every like Silicon Valley exec has a blood boy, specifically for that purpose.
And I should be clear, overall, Lemmy actually comes off like a pretty decent guy. Definitely gruff, definitely into 70s rock and roll excess, but not overly slimy, which maybe subverts my expectation a little bit.
And he has a great sense of humor.
He has a great sense of humor, exactly.
Which is wild.
And
I'm glad to hear some of this because in the interviews that I've watched, A, I could barely understand him, and B, it was only about all of the insane, terrible stuff. So hearing like the insight, like, oh, he was a Beatles fan, and yeah,
I
He
would
liked
say, yeah,
ponies.
He liked-
in addition to all that, he has a lot of reverence for musicians and rock and rollers that came before him. I hear him talk about those a lot, and we'll mention a couple others as it goes. Okay, so back to our story, right? Drugs, as we know, are great at a lot of things, but what they can really help with is making new friends. So he bonds with a guy called Dick Mick, who was in a band called, what's his name?
I
Is that
think
one
how you
name? Is that
pronounce
one
it.
name or two
It's
names?
one name, no space.
Okay.
Dikmik.
Okay, it's Dick Mick. Okay.
And Dick Mick was in Hawkwind, and he bonds with him through their mutual love of speed.
Right.
Now,
Of course.
there is a Hawkwind record with Lemmy playing on it on Robert Dimery's list as well. It's called Space Ritual. So we're going to save diving into
Oh.
that band for another day. They have a whole interesting story, I'm sure. They were a very experimental, loose collective of early psych rock noisemakers, right? But we're going to quickly relate Lemmy joining and then ultimately leaving that band to form Motorhead just to get on with our story. So he's friends with the one guy in the band. And one night, the Hawkwind bass player does not show up for the gig. They're frantically looking around for a bass player. And his mate Dick Mick goes, "Hey, Lemmy plays bass." Now, at this point, I should remind you that Lemmy plays guitar and has never ever touched a bass. But lucky for
So
him,
he is a natural bass player.
exactly. But the bass player's actual instrument was left behind in the band, so bad move there because he didn't even own a bass, of course, and no one else owns a bass. The actual bass player who flaked, his bass was left behind, and according to Lemmy, they just throw him on stage that night with no prep. He claims he had zero idea what he was doing, but says it must have gone all right because I was with them for 4 years.
Damn.
Dude, that is a great introduction to the band story.
Yeah,
Wow.
they seem pretty out there in a lot of ways. I am excited to get into them and tell their story another time, but audio, visual, acid heads, that seems like that was just the type of band it was. No one knew who was going to show up for which gig, that kind of thing. So
Okay.
he tours with Hawkwind for years, and he even writes some songs with them, and he even sings on some of those songs. And you can go back and listen to some of those. His voice is actually quite different, much more melodious, let's say. But he eventually gets fired after getting arrested at the Canadian border with speed. Now, Lemmy mentions several times, I think he might be still holding a grudge, that he was fired not for doing drugs, but for doing the wrong drugs. Because everyone else in the band was deep into acid, but his speed habit was considered uncouth and ungentlemanly.
And could get you arrested. I assume, was acid illegal at this point, or was this that weird in between? Because if everybody else is just walking around town with it.
It's a good point. No, it must have been illegal by now because now we must be around 1970 or 70.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
Because he's in the band for like 4 years. Yeah. So he ends up leaving the band in 75. The point is, they were all free love and drugs, but they just didn't like the drugs he was doing. They thought that was uncool.
Got it.
So, okay, so here he finds himself in 1975. He's a bass player now after 4 years of playing with Hawkwind, with some scenester cred, but without a band. He decides to make his own, of course, right? He forms Motorhead pretty much instantly upon returning to the UK. The concept for the band is MC5 with Little Richard mixed together.
Wait, that
Which
was
actually-
the concept?
That's the concept, yeah.
Okay.
Huh.
Interesting.
Which that actually really helped me contextualize the music we're going to listen to. I think there is a lot of early rock and roll, like Little Richard, in there. It's much
Also-
noisier, but it has a lot of those elements.
Right. Also, someone probably who was on a lot of speed, and also real quick, sure, maybe he got kicked out of Hawkwind for doing different drugs, but imagine you're in a band with a bunch of people on acid, and you're on speed. Imagine
Yeah.
those shows.
Yeah, indeed. And I'm sure there were other reasons too. I mean, it sounds like he was trying to push his way to the front of the band. He was writing more material, he was singing more material, and there was some politics, inner band politics, as there would be, right? With the guy who felt like it was his band that was not Lemmy. So anyway, he goes home, he forms a band. The original name for the group, this is a great name actually, is Bastard.
Oh
Ooh.
man.
Yeah.
But he is
cool.
advised that Top of the Pops won't let him on the air with that name, so he changes it to the U.S. slang name for a speed freak, and that is Motorhead.
Nice.
Now, not coincidentally at all, Motorhead was the name of the last song he wrote and recorded with Hawkwind, and he sings on it too. So there's a recording of Hawkwind doing the song Motorhead, which is also the name of a song, and there's a recording of Motorhead doing it. So it's kind of interesting.
Why do you put the umlaut over the second O? Is there something there?
I'm glad, it's not in my notes, but I did read about this. There's no particular reason other than to look cool or to look tough.
Okay.
But it is postulated one of the bands they toured with early on in, I think even in the Rockin' Vickers day, or maybe it was the Hawkwind days. Anyway, a band he knew from the scene in the UK was Blue Oyster Cult, who also has an unnecessary umlaut.
Okay.
I've never noticed that. Wow. All right.
So this band comes together pretty quick. I'm sure you were thinking it took a lot of deep planning to get Motorhead together, but no, he's fired in May of 1975. Motorhead's first gig is in July of 1975.
So I assume he kept the bass that he
That's a good
stole
question.
from the
Yeah, it's a good question. He probably left with the bass. That was his going away present. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And so, at this point in this first gig, in this first incarnation, they're playing songs, Hawkwind songs that Lemmy wrote for Hawkwind, plus a couple new tunes, plus covers. And despite some initial success and momentum, there's some speed bumps. I put speed in quotes, get it?
Nice.
They get a record deal. They make a record for United Artists, but it ends up getting shelved because the label isn't satisfied. It ends up coming out years later as a cash-in after they get a little more cred, called On Parole. But technically, that is the first thing they recorded ever. While they're waiting to find out what happens to that recording, because the label isn't super forthcoming, they're under contract, whatever, they get a different label to pay for a single, which they make. But then the first label won't let them release it because they're still under contract. So they're running into all these challenges. They can't get a single or an album out, right? And so the band undergoes some swap outs. But at this point, after some of that legal label-based kerfuffle, the classic lineup of the classic lineup of Motorhead, the one that plays on Ace of Spades and that the fans consider the classic lineup, is cemented. So let's just go over who is in this band. We have Phil Filthy Animal Taylor on drums. We have, of course, Lemmy Kilmister on bass. And we have a guy called Fast Eddie Clarke on guitar. I feel like he got the worst name, but he's pretty good.
Yeah.
He's pretty good. Now, interestingly, the story I heard is that Fast Eddie came in to audition with the band as a second guitar player on top of the other guy that was there previously for that first recording. But for some bizarre reason, after the audition, the first guy quits. And they're like, I guess we have to hire this other guy. So they tried to make it into quartet. They couldn't do it. That's the story.
That drummer, Filthy Taylor, man, that guy's a piece of work. Some of the interviews I saw, he looks like, I can't even think of anything to come up. Anyway, you
like a raccoon with a mustache or something.
Yeah,
yeah, he's a character.
Bald raccoon. Yeah. Yes.
We're going to get into some of his antics shortly. So finally now they're off contract. Lineup is cemented, but unfortunately the momentum that they had died. Think about it. He's coming off of Hawkwind. He's got some cred. They play some shows. They're getting a little heat. And through these label woes and lineup changes, it just kind of dies down. They actually all agree to quit the band, right? And they even book a farewell show to end the band officially. But yet another label guy intervenes and says they should record that show with a mobile recording studio, which was fresh, new, cool tech at the time. Now, unsurprisingly, that guy probably taking some kind of drugs with the band when he suggested that does not come through. But at the last second, the guy says, you know what? I'll pay for you to go into the studio and record a single, right? Before you break up. You should at least do that. Let's do that, right? So they have 2 days in the studio, but instead of finishing one song, they take a big swing and they do 11 songs.
Oh, wow.
In 2 days?
Yes, by never stopping because they're taking, wait for it, lots and lots of speed.
Oh, so wait, are you saying that the recording isn't sped up?
No, the recording is not sped up. This is what becomes the first release called Motorhead, the self-titled release, right? Now, incidentally, this album has some of the previously recorded Hawkwind songs, like I mentioned. It also has a cover of Train Kept a Rollin', which is an old song, but we probably all know it from Aerosmith.
Yep.
Last just weird thing, reason for me to plug one of our old episodes, a cover they record and leave off the record is ZZ Top's Beer Drinkers and Hellraisers. So if you want to hear us give our thoughts on that particular tune, go back all the way to episode 19, where we covered
Wow.
ZZ Top's Trace Hombres.
That is a great album and a great episode. Yes.
When we were but wee lads poking our heads over the consoles here. So now the band is rolling. They got some wind under their sails. Things are finally starting to happen. They schedule a tour. And then literally the night before their first gig, the drummer punches a junkie and breaks his finger. So what do? Speed. No. No, they go on with the tour. Every night they tape a drumstick into his casted hand with gaffer's tape and play the shows that way. Yeah. Because, listen, drugs can get you through a lot. Let's be clear.
By the way, I saw an interview with the drummer and he said he slapped the guy and broke all his knuckles. I'm like, wait a minute, hang on.
This guy has
something different in England.
That could have referred to one of 100 incidents, because I think this guy gets in a lot of fights. We're going to hear about more injuries that waylay the band. So anyway, that tour goes pretty well. The band's really rolling now. They book a bigger tour, and the drummer breaks his wrist 2 shows in. Speed, sadly, will not fix that one, so they have to cancel. They're very close to calling it quits again as a band. The momentum they had built at this point had dissipated. The record they released didn't do too much, and the band is restless, with the guys even taking breaks to go play gigs with other bands, like actively trying to poach them. But luckily, at the last second, a new record company swoops in and signs them for a single. They head into the studio and they record a cover of, get this, Louie Louie.
Oh, God. No.
And it somehow cracks the top 100. It's like hits 68.
It's like they're doing everything possible to fail. It's just not working.
I've heard that version. I can't stand that version. They occasionally play it on classic rock radio, and he sounds like, all right. So the very first time I ever heard Motorhead, I don't know, maybe 12 or 13, and I was still watching the Power Rangers, which was a kid's television show, and there was a villain on there named Goldar, and he would talk like this. And I heard Motorhead, and I thought, oh my God, the same guy, the cartoon villain Goldar, has started a band. So hearing him sing "UA" with his interesting pronunciation never rubbed me the right way.
Yeah, I hear you. I don't think Lemmy's voice, he's not going to do an album of standards anytime soon, right. I think, yeah. So that little minimal success leads to their second album called Overkill. The third album is called Bomber. That ends up charting at 11. The whole time they've been building an audience by touring constantly. So now finally we're up to the recording of this record, Ace of Spades, in the summer of 1980. They've been working for the last couple episodes. They've been working with a different guy called Jimmy Miller to produce the previous 2 records, which that guy's claim to fame, and it's a big one, is producing all the major Stones records, including Let It Bleed and Sticky Fingers. And if you want to hear us talk about Let It Bleed, covered it on episode 84. But definitely great bona fides as a producer, but they aren't fully satisfied. They want to better capture the live energy of the band, the intensity, and they decide to change up the producer to a guy called Vic Mahl. This was a guy who had worked the mobile studio that actually recorded that Hawkwind live album called Space Ritual, the one that is also on Robert Dimery's list that we will eventually get to. Now,
not to be confused with Dick Lick or whatever the guy's name.
Not Dick Mick. Dick Mick was in the band Hawkwind.
Oh, right.
And his job was, I'm excited to get to Hawkwind, literally, because I think Dick Mick's job was like noisemaker or something. Like he just literally just twiddled knobs for and they would like dose the entire crowd at their shows and stuff. Like it sounds like it was a wild time.
That's funny.
But this guy Vic Mal just worked with the band, and now he's going to work with Motorhead. His nickname, by the way, is the Turtle because he looks like a turtle. Not only does he not do drugs or drink or have any kind of hard living, he's like the quietest, most unassuming guy. He's a diabetic. And as Lemmy said, like, I think this was part of it because they felt like they couldn't just bowl over him because he would like die. So they had to kind of be nice to him. I think this helped in their minds. But he said Lemmy thought the guy really instinctively understood rock and roll. He thought Vic was the perfect guy for them. And, you know, this is one of the things I think that makes Lemmy come off like a reasonable dude, which he's like, all bands need someone who's not in the band to sit there and be an asshole. And this guy was able to be an asshole to us, even though we were big, scary guys, wild men, you know, and we wouldn't wrestle him to the ground and pummel him, I guess, for fear of his death. So they head to a place called Rickmansworth. Sure, I'm pronouncing that wrong. Just north of London.
Yeah, you got it.
The place called Jackson Studios in August of 1980 for the recording. They end up spending about 6 weeks on this thing. Now, I searched high and low for details about recording sessions here because by Lemmy's own admission, this 6 weeks was way longer than it took to make any of their previous records. And to be honest, like, I am also surprised based on what's on the tape. There's very little detail. I'm guessing that's because most of the record is live with some vocal overdubs and guitar overdubs occasionally. But, you know, a lot of it does sound like a live band. So I think they definitely accomplished that.
Yeah, probably a couple like hospital visits, you know, hospital breaks in between,
right.
you know.
A couple of days off for hangovers in there. So I read that one of the reasons that it did take longer, though, is because this new producer, Vic, really pushed them to work harder, to refine the material more, to work more on the riffs, make them a little more complex, get better takes, etc. So this is also apparently the first time the band had either no say or almost no say in the mixing stage. The result of which, according to the band itself, is that for once you could actually hear everything.
You can. I mean, it's all a little compressed, but you can hear everything.
Yeah, definitely. Well, it's funny for me to try to picture Lemmy in the studio with like a notepad and a pencil being like, oh, we should go to like the diminished seventh there, you know, or whatever it would be. I'm sure they're not having any diminished chords.
Yeah,
but
like
like the idea of them like workshopping a song is so foreign to me. It sounds like he would walk in and be like, here's the song, play it or die. You know?
Yeah.
Right.
Actually, it's like here's the title. We don't have a song yet. Just start playing.
Yeah, he does sound kind of like a WWF guy, but you hear you kind of hear the material that like Randy Savage would crank out, or, you know, in the 90s.
I think he had some kind of WWF, WWE career later in life because he had some kind of relationship with Triple H, but I think he must have made some appearances on Monday Night Raw. So yeah, that fits.
That's wild.
Insane.
Nice.
I don't have all the details on that, but okay. So Ace of Spades comes out in October of 1980 on Bronze Records, and that leads us to our very favorite segment here on the show. Let's do Motorhead by the numbers.
Woo!
Yeah.
All right. Number 13 is the first number. That is the highest the single Ace of Spades ever charted in the UK. When you asked that happen? In 2015, the week after Lemmy died at age 70.
Well, better late than never. All right.
When it came out, it was a charting hit. It peaked at 15, but I'm using that as an example to show that the album and the band have only gained in cult status as time has gone on, which is an interesting phenomenon in and of itself. Next up, 100K. That is the estimated number of copies sold of this album in the UK. Now, recall that that's a much smaller market than the US, so 300K in the UK is platinum, but for such a relatively well-known band and rock and roll figure, it's not that many. Right. When you really think about it. And this is definitely their most successful album. Now, the album charted in the UK and in the US at the time of its release. Their follow-up live album called No Sleep Till Hammersmith sold about the same and is also on Dime Race lists. So for sure, this is the band's peak era. Next number 28, the highest chart position on the US Billboard Hot 100 that Lemmy ever got to. And what he estimates to be the most lucrative song for him overall is the 1990s Ozzy hit Mama, I'm Coming Home, for which Lemmy wrote the lyrics.
No, I did not know. That's a good song. I didn't. That's great.
Now, Lemmy has made it clear that while Ace of Spades gave him a living in music, he ain't rich. And he did say several times that this song paid him more than anything Motorhead had done up to that point.
That's wild. All right.
That was interesting, right? Okay, we have two more. Next number is number 17. That is the age of the president of the U.S. Motorhead fan club back in 1980, who was very excited to get his hands on this Ace of Spades record. His name was Lars Ulrich, soon to be
No
drummer for
way.
fledgling thrash metal band Metallica, which formed about 1 year later.
Shut up.
He definitely speaks highly of Metallica.
Yeah, and I think they're one of the most obvious pieces of the lineage of Motorhead. That kind of fast and heavy thing. I think Metallica, if I may say, even on Metallica's first album, expanded on it, made it more complex, added in some of that kind of progginess that I think we all love. But I think definitely Motorhead is seen as a progenitor of that thrash genre that was just about to pop off, right? So, and lastly, in the by the numbers segment, we have at least one, and that is the number of historically bad bass players that Lemmy inspired with his words. Now, in White Line Fever, he tells the story of giving bass lessons to one Sid Vicious. But after 3 lessons, he had to tell him, Sid, you can't play bass. And Sid apparently responded with, yeah, I know, and then walked away sullenly into the waiting arms of uber punk band in need of bad bass player, the Sex Pistols.
Right.
Good.
Wow. All right.
And last but not least, I'm not going to attach a number to it, but we just want to say thank you for listening to this show every week, for telling your friends about it, for getting on the Motorhead subreddit and yelling and complaining about whatever the heck we're about to say about these songs. We love it. We do this for our enjoyment, of course, but we're super happy that your enjoyment. If you want to support us, of course, just listening every week is a great way to do that. If you want to go a step farther, leave us a 5-star review on any podcast app that accepts ratings or reviews like Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And if you want to go a step further, hop on over to Patreon. We have the link in the show notes every week. We have a great community there. You can join for free. You can continue the discussion about this album. There's a great comment thread now every week. And of course, we publish bonus content, have votes on what albums we're going to do coming up, things like that. Go join. It's free. We would love you for it. Okay, we are almost to talking about the songs, but I just thought we'd do a little bit of aftermath here. So on the eve of the tour to support the record, Ace of Spades, Filthy Phil is at a bar and breaks his neck.
Oh, God.
Now, luckily, he's only paralyzed temporarily.
Oh, that's good.
But this dude, I don't know if you saw this in the video you watched, but this dude has a calcium lump the size of a lemon on the back of his neck for the rest of his life because of that.
Oh my God. They're really a band of gargoyles. It's remarkable.
Now, I alluded to it in the story, but this band, and particularly this record, were really inspiring. Certainly for the up-tempo thrash metal bands that were about to come on the scene, including the so-called Big Four of Metallica, Megadeth, Slayer, and Anthrax. But another musical note is that this also cross-pollinated with punk, really for the first time, and the burgeoning hardcore scene, this fast and loud aesthetic. So whereas metal godfathers like Black Sabbath slowed everything down to make it evil, Motorhead deserves some credit or blame for ramping things up. And, the drug speed also deserves some of that credit.
Sure.
But this, I kept hearing again and again that this was the one thing in the 80s that the punks and the metalheads could agree on. It kind of was the meeting point of those two genres. And lastly, this Motorhead lineup that we've been describing, it lasted for one more studio album only, released in 1982, but Motorhead, the band, kept releasing albums, 22 of them, in fact, up until Lemmy's death at the age of 70 in 2015 from a combination of congestive heart failure and prostate cancer. And that, of course, is when the band officially called it quits.
Wow.
I mean, how could you go on without him,
Yeah, he is the band. He is the band.
I'm
He said that multiple
surprised
times.
he made it that far.
We all are.
Right? That's
Yeah.
really impressive. Like, good on you, dude.
Indeed. Okay. Do you want to get into some songs, gents?
Let's
Hell
do it.
yes.